Good afternoon, and welcome to Extreme Communications, a RUSI webinar on strategic communications in the contemporary international landscape. This is the first of two webinars bringing together authors featured in the RUSI Journal special issue on strategic communications. My name is Alistair Reid. I'm the editor of this special issue and also an associate professor at the Cyber Threats Research Centre at Swansea University. And I'm joined today on this panel by three distinguished experts. Firstly, Nafis Hamid, a fellow at Artists International and a PhD researcher at University College London. And he'll be talking about the ecology of extremist communications. Secondly, Maura Conway, professor at Dublin City University and coordinator of VoxPol, and she'll be presenting her paper on routing the right. And last but not least, Matt Thuria, who's a communications manager of the STRIVE project in Afghanistan and Kenya. And he'll be talking about preventative communications and drawing some emerging lessons from a project that he's been running in Kenya. Our panelists will be talking about a diverse range of topics, which reflects the objective of the special issue, in which we wanted to highlight the multiple dimensions of strategic communications and its broad applications across counterterrorism and countering violent extremism policy. The format for today's panel will be that each of the panelists will give a short presentation on the work, followed by a live Q&A for the second half of the webinar. Before I start, some short housekeeping. This event is being recorded, and some of you will be taking part via Zoom, and others will be watching via the live stream on YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter. Unfortunately, we will only be able to take questions from those of you who are on Zoom via the chat function. And secondly, Taylor Francis have very generously agreed to make the special issue open access until the end of June. So please take this opportunity to follow the link on the events page and check out the special issue. Without any further delay, I'd like to pass over to my colleague Nafis Hamid to give the first presentation.
Hello, thank you. Thank you, Alistair. Thank you to my fellow panelists and to RUSI for giving me the opportunity to first publish this article and then now the opportunity to talk about it. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about the ecology of extremist communications. And basically what that means is that we have this sort of naive notion of sort of how propaganda works. And that naive notion is that these messages go out into the ether, they go out into on the internet or wherever, and that propaganda by itself has the ability to directly change people's beliefs. However, when you start looking at the research, start breaking down, looking at the sociology of these things, you start noticing that actually it's not the way things actually work. So across a variety of different domains, you start seeing that the social ecology really matters of the environment in which those messages are going into and the impact that it has. So for example, take religion. How do people convert religions? How do they actually change their religious beliefs? Seems like random preachers don't seem to have much of an impact, research has shown. Also televangelists or like radio preachers or people doing like extreme dawah on the streets, for example, doesn't seem to have a statistically significant effect on religious conversions when you look at the population level. Religious conversion largely happens on a friend-to-friend basis, kind of person-to-person persuasion. Even in commercial advertising, you see a similar effect where people have a tendency to think, you know, Coca-Cola, Pepsi, whoever puts out these commercials, and all of a sudden people want to change their mind about what product they like. Turns out that research on advertising shows that that's also usually not the case, that actually when people have experience with the product, the more commercials you throw at them, it doesn't really change their mind, especially if they've already made up their mind about whether they like Pepsi or Coke more. If they have no experience with the product, it can have a small impact. And there's a lot of money that that commercial advertisers spend on getting celebrities to advertise for their products. And interestingly enough, a lot of the standard sort of beliefs we have about like sex sells or celebrity sells, it doesn't really seem to bear out in the evidence. What does seem to happen is that when people are an expert in a domain, that can have a positive impact. So, you know, world heavyweight champion boxer Anthony Joshua may be able to help sell sporting goods, but maybe not as well selling perfume, for example. So the expertise matters. I'm going to come back to that a little bit later. Research on voter attitudes related to political campaigns and political ads, like online commercials or television commercials or flyering, also basically shows that it doesn't have a long-term effect on voter attitude. It can change behavior, and I'll get back to this, how it changes behavior, but so it can maybe demotivate people to want to go out to the polls and vote, or it can motivate people to go out, but it doesn't seem to change their core fundamental beliefs, just these campaign ads going out by themselves. In fact, there's some evidence that it can even backfire if you give strong campaign ads to people who really disagree with that particular position. It can make them more reticent. Even the historical research on Nazi propaganda shows that it was not what we tend to think about in sort of the popular imagination, that the Nazis had this amazing propaganda machine that just radicalized the whole country. It was pretty amazing what they were doing in terms of the effort they were putting out and the sophistication of what they were doing. However, what the research has shown is actually that they were able to increase favorable attitudes for their positions in areas where there was already historically high anti-Semitism. In areas where there was low anti-Semitism, you actually saw a backfire effect that happened. In fact, I recommend many people to read Ian Kershaw's book, where he actually takes a quote from the Nazis themselves actually were doing their own analysis of how effective their propaganda was. And one of their own internal notes was, our propaganda fails everywhere because people see it as lying and deceptive. And that sort of brings us to what actually does matter. Why is it that certain messages are received, and why is it that they transmit? And that's, again, the social ecology, it's the environment, it's the person, largely person to person. And so across all of these domains where you do see core values and beliefs change, there's usually some person to person element in it. And that person-to-person element, there's two crucial factors that seem to come out in the research when it comes to messenger attributes. One is trustworthiness, which basically means, do you perceive that this person who's communicating to you, that their incentives align with your own? If people perceive that the messenger has an ulterior motive, then that's going to undermine a lot of their efforts. So whether you're trying to de-radicalize or prevent someone or persuade someone's belief or whatever you're trying to do, if they don't see that your incentives align with their own, it's going to reduce the credibility of your message. Another thing is authoritativeness. Now, I talked to a lot of foreign fighters, people who came back, and a lot of them will say that they knew that they had loved ones who were very against what they were going to do and were trying to persuade them. But the truth is, they didn't really respect their opinion on this topic. They didn't consider them to be authoritative. One guy I was talking to was saying, yeah, of course my mother told me not to go to Syria and that this was not Islam or whatever, but I didn't trust her opinion on geopolitics or religion. So it didn't really matter. And the same goes for some people's attitudes towards moderate imams. People keep telling moderate imams need to go out there. But the problem is that the extremist groups are very good at lowering the credibility of moderate imams, even by giving them questions to go ask the imams to prove that they can't actually answer those questions in order to lower their credibility. So those are two really important factors at the messenger level. Another aspect that's more about sort of the hotspots themselves. I mean, one thing that sort of gives away the game that propaganda by itself doesn't change people's beliefs is the fact that you have hotspots. The very existence of these hotspots show you that it can't just be mere exposure to the propaganda that is going to cause you to radicalize. And the fact that it concentrates in these tight-knit areas speaks, one, to the importance of messengers and people radicalizing each other within their networks, but you also start noticing certain similarities between hotspots, and oftentimes there's a breakdown in sort of the social order. And now this varies a lot from like the European situation versus North Africa or the Middle East. But one thing that you basically see is some sort of breakdown in authority, breakdown in families, breakdown in, you could roughly call it community resilience. So sometimes it's because there's an actual civil war going on. Sometimes there's intertribal conflict going on. Sometimes it's just like turf war. And oftentimes there's sort of a very poor relationship between community members and authority figures, that there is a sense that there is no real authority in the situation, and therefore we kind of have to regulate ourselves a little bit, and then there's distrust within that sort of what one would perceive necessarily as being the in-group, which kind of fractures and atomizes the community and then makes them easy to pull people out. As I'm running short on time here, so I'm going to just jump now to the individual attributes. So one big thing that's important is that when people start actually radicalizing each other, start sharing messages with each other, start creating these echo chambers and communicating these ideas to each other, something interesting starts happening with the value systems themselves. And they start to, what we call, social psychologists call, sacralize their values. These values start moving more and more into the sacred domain, which just basically means that you don't really think about them in cost benefit analysis terms. Standard business negotiation is probably not going to persuade this person. You can't really explain this person's reasoning about these values in sort of rational actor terms. We use the term devoted actor. That's a framework that we're continuing to build up to kind of explain how people are willing to make extreme costly sacrifices that seem all out of proportion to rational self-interest in service of these values. And we did the first neuroimaging research on this topic with radicalized populations. And one of the interesting findings that we have, especially with a more radicalized population for which we did these brain scans, is that an area that's associated with deliberative reasoning and self-reflection, the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, is basically deactivated when people are thinking about their sacred values. When they have important but non-sacred values, you see not only that part of the brain active, but you see another part of the brain called the ventromedial prefrontal cortex that's active. And that has to do with subjective valuation. And these two parts of the brain usually work in tandem when making decisions. So think about, you're out at dinner and the waiter brings you a menu for dessert and you think, well, that tiramisu looks really good, I might have it. Think, but I worked out today, I'm trying to lose weight. Well, that's your brain making this decision between what do I want, subjective values versus this sort of more rational long-term thinking. And these two things kind of work in tandem until you finally arrive at a decision. This is the way normal functioning works. This is how we make most of our decisions. And even extremists with their non-sacred values also use both of these parts of their brain. When the sacred values activate, the part that's associated with deliberative reasoning goes offline. And so you largely have this subjective value part of the brain that's running the show. Now you can understand that this is going to be very hard for comms if you're trying to reach this person, persuade this person, negotiate with this person. It's the part of the brain that's supposed to be receiving this message and actually integrating it into its decision-making process is turned off. Now, there is a way that we learned in our studies to actually reactivate it and reconnect it with the subjective value part of the brain, and that is norm intervention, when you can convince people that actually their peers do not actually share their willingness to commit violence in service of these values as much as they do. And I'm going to go into that a little bit more when we get to maybe sort of the policy suggestions. So I'll just leave that as a teaser maybe for now.
Thank you very much for that, Nafis. I have lots of questions for you, but I'll leave that until the end. I'd like to pass over to Matt now to give the next presentation.
Thank you, Alistair, and thank you, Nafis. And thanks to RUSI again for hosting this event and the opportunity to publish the article. Our article that I co-wrote with Andrew Glazard is in two parts. First, it talks about theory, and then it gets practical. And the practical bit is describing some activities that were conducted as part of a preventing violent extremism program in Kenya over the past few years. We use theory to illustrate how communication is about more than the transmission of message alone. And this sort of really picks up on what's the sort of things that Nafis is talking about. In particular, we point to it as a social process of meaning making, and also as a performative act by the communicator. We realized when we looked into it that these relatively unexplored aspects of communication could help address some of the factors that research consistently tells us underpin violent extremism. So for instance, strengthening the social mediated process of communication and the individual capacity to communicate could be harnessed to address things like individual incentives, such as the search for purpose and belonging, and also structural issues around exclusion and grievance, as well as the way that terrorism and violent extremism itself is framed in the media. So this theory was developed to link countering violent extremism to media and communications area that actually have existed for many years, but are relatively unused in this area. So including media development, and we talk about conflict-sensitive journalism in particular, which I'll come to, and development communications, and we built on a strand of communications for social change, and also media literacy with a focus on propaganda literacy. So in the second part of the article, we go into the pilot communications activities that were implemented, and they were implemented as part of a larger violence extremism program called Strive, where the other components involved law enforcement training, research, and mentorship. The media and communication strand was organized into two areas. First, training of local radio stations in Kenya in conflict-sensitive journalism. Here, the emphasis was on strengthening longer format reporting. This allowed for a deeper dive into underreported social issues underpinning violent conflict. And technical training sought to help journalists increase the factual accuracy of their reporting, diversify their sources used in their stories, and avoid inflammatory language. And techniques involved looking closely at how to include voices and perspectives of marginalized groups. In this case, that often meant the hard-to-reach youth living in slum areas of Mombasa. Overall, it was about expanding the way the media talk about terrorism and its causes beyond the framing that can often feel like us versus them. The second area of communications activities was integrated with the mentorship strand at Strive. So mentorship involves 200 youth in Nairobi and at the coast, and those youth are assessed to be at risk of being recruited or radicalized into Al-Shabaab and other violent extremist groups. These mentees are supported by 40 of their peers who form a network and have been developed and trained and supported as mentors. In this second area, the mentors and mentees were led through a series of activities focused around bottom-up storytelling. We sought to build their capacity to be the communicator using the smartphone they carry, and through that they could explore their own sense of purpose, identity, and participate in wider public conversation. This element of strengthening the voice and participation of at-risk youth was bolstered with propaganda and media literacy training, which sought to help them to identify and ignore some of the manipulative and harmful aspects of violent propaganda. Indeed, some of the things that Nafis has mentioned. We drew several observations from these experiences. First, in the area of media and journalism, that broadening the knowledge of journalists about the origins of terrorism and linking that knowledge to ideas of conflict was relevant in supporting the media to more accurately report on violence extremism. And that diversifying that range of voices that get onto air and the perspectives they bring with them had that potential to have a transformative effect on the way that reporting is carried out. Second, when it comes to working with youth, the journey and that process of storytelling and communicating, as much as the destination of creating finished content, created some new opportunities for the young people involved to explore those issues around value, purpose, and identity. So let me wind up by saying that this work is currently being independently evaluated, and we won't have the results for a few months. But in the Strive programme and in the context, I'd emphasise that we've been independent in our approach, and that has meant that we have avoided many other government-led communications interventions that do tend to be linear, top-down, and there is research to show that they are probably ineffective in terms of the specifics of preventing and countering violent extremism. We think this sort of approach is likely to be more productive, as it's about engagement rather than messaging alone. So this novel application of long-standing but underused communications theory and practice in a difficult context, and that's the field of counterterrorism, seems to us worth sharing, and we hopefully will be developed further. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you very much, Matt. Just a reminder to everyone watching, if you have any questions, please feel free to submit them via the Q&A function. Now I'd like to pass over to Maura about her paper.
Thanks everybody for joining us. I'm very happy to be here. I want to say a few words about my paper in the RUSI Journal special issue. And basically it asks a question that I get asked quite a lot, which is to say, okay, if major social media platforms have successfully routed IS, why can't they do the same with the extreme right? And so I want to pretty much gallop through in the next 5 minutes, 5 pretty good reasons and interrelated reasons, I guess you could say, why this is a more complex kind of a question than it might first appear. So the first difficulty here is actually the fact that the question contains a category error. IS is a group as pretty much traditionally understood, whereas the extreme right is a scene, a milieu. Nafisa already mentioned the word ecology, a movement or a conglomeration of movements, an ideology. We could go on. So that's a first difficulty. There's a related difficulty here, which is to say that also IS is this group that was designated a terrorist group by a very large number of governments worldwide relatively shortly after its emergence. So what we have here is a terrorist group on the one hand versus an ideology on the other. Out of which has emerged acts of terrorism without doubt, but many of the people who carried out those terrorist attacks on the right have had no obvious connections with any terrorist groups as traditionally understood. So once IS had been designated a terrorist group by a large number of governments, it was relatively straightforward for major social media platforms to agree to take down this terrorist group content, which they were in effect required to do by many of these governments. There are 4, to the best of my knowledge, extreme right-wing groups that are presently designated terrorist organizations. And we can talk a little bit more in the Q&A if people are interested in this question of designation, but it's quite important for online platforms, both major platforms and smaller platforms in terms of decision making. Number 2 point is this. IS, this terrorist group, actually had a very well thought through branding strategy, which worked quite well for them on the one hand, but also worked further down the line for major social media platforms to relatively easily begin to find IS content and begin to remove it from their platforms, because they began to use various technologies that could draw on this branding in order to find the content. There is some branded extreme right content out there, but probably the largest part of it. So the vast bulk of online extreme right content is not branded in the same way, and so can be quite difficult to find. And this is in conjunction too with the use of a lot of memes, for example, and that kind of thing by extreme right users, and a lot of sort of irony and so-called humor and joking etc. So all of that builds up to make it really quite difficult for available tools for finding terrorist content to be deployed in respect of extreme right content that hasn't been produced by designated terrorist organizations or hasn't been produced during an attack, for example. The third point that I make in the article is about the shift that's taken place in the so-called Overton window over the last number of years. And so this means that, you know, what it is acceptable to say or to contribute in the public discourse has shifted over the last number of years more clearly rightward. And this is true globally. So going back to Nafis again, the sort of social ecology has actually changed quite considerably, both in the real world and indeed even more rightward in a lot of online settings. Why is this relevant in terms of takedown of extreme right content from major social media platforms? Well, there are actually quite a lot of people in positions of power in government, in media, in a great many spheres at the present time, who are sympathetic to the extreme right cause. And this really was not the case with respect to, for example, Islamic State. On the contrary, many of the same people were very vocal about the necessity to remove so-called Islamic State content from those very same platforms. So increasingly, any crackdown or any disruption of extreme right content by major social media platforms is actually sort of viewed with disdain, if you like, by people who are in the more conservative sphere broadly. So that's another issue that feeds into point number 4, which is to say that there is money to be made from extreme right activity on online platforms to a much greater degree than there was to be made from Islamic State. So we can see from the data that the user base on major social media platforms for Islamic State really was never huge, whereas there are extreme right figures who are active on major social media platforms whose removal from those platforms could very significantly impact the likely growth of the same platforms and thereby their ability to make money. So there is a monetization or financial issues at play here that are important, I think, also. And then finally, I talk in the paper about the importance of the US legal context in this discussion. So most major social media platforms that we care to think of are not just Western companies, but they're US companies. And so they've had a tendency, unsurprisingly, over the years to have a pretty significant focus in their decision-making on the US First Amendment, which is with regard to free speech issues. However, no other country, including no other Western democratic country, shares the sort of permissive attitude to speech that is encapsulated in the US First Amendment and in associated case law, such as the decision in Brandenburg versus Ohio, which basically requires that imminent lawless action be about to happen for something to cross the threshold from free speech into speech that can be acted against. So this has a number of upshots. One is that major US social media companies are pretty loath to contravene the spirit of the First Amendment, even though because they're private companies, they can take a lot of action without actually contravening the letter of the First Amendment. A second important factor is that even when extreme right-wing users are in fact taken down by these platforms because of the nature of some of their content, it has been relatively easy for them to migrate to other platforms also set up in the US because of the permissions, as it were, given by the First Amendment. So there's a lot of leeway there that wasn't available to IS supporters, for example. So at the end of the day, I guess it comes down to this. It's relatively straightforward if a group is designated as a terrorist group for a major social media platform to take down that content. However, most extreme right content doesn't fall into this category. So instead, where we find ourselves is in a much more tricky sort of position, which is to say, what's the right thing to do with respect to takedown of potentially violently radicalizing content.
Great, thank you very much, Maura. Well, I'm just waiting for everyone, give everyone a chance to get their questions in. I'm going to take the chair's prerogative and ask Nafees a question. One of the things I found fascinating from your paper, Nafees, was the reference to social norms and about how a possibility of using persuading people about to change up social norms and influencing their behavior. I wondered if you could expand on that a bit.
Yeah, with pleasure. So yeah, what we did in our first one of the neuroimaging studies was that when participants were looking at their sacred and non-sacred values, they had to rate on a scale of 1 to 7 their willingness to fight and die for these values. And then in the second part of the study, we gave them the consensus information. This is what other Muslims from your community, non-radicalized people, but still people they identified with who were from their community. This is what they said, that this is how much they'd be willing to fight and die for the value. So it's not that the community disagreed with their value, the content of the value. And we didn't tell them whether the community thought it was sacred or not. I mean, they didn't even know we were categorizing it as sacred or non-sacred. They just knew that the community was not willing to do the same kinds of actions, particularly violent actions, in defense of these beliefs, even though they agreed with the beliefs, presumably. And that not only behaviorally, in the third part of the study, caused those radicalized participants to decrease their own willingness to fight and die. We saw a reactivation of areas associated with deliberative reasoning and self-reflection come online, and a reconnectivity between that area and subjective values. And that fits in very nicely with the work that's been done on sort of media influence. I'm using social norms in post-conflict regions. Elizabeth Pollack has done some work in the Republic of Congo and in Rwanda as well. In post-conflict Rwanda, what they were doing is people, as we know, listen to radio programs a lot and soap operas and get a lot of entertainment as well as news from radios. And so they were at the time running different kinds of soap operas in different villages in Rwanda. And some of them had this reconciliation themed soap opera that was being played in some villages, and then other villages were randomly assigned to be listening to a health oriented soap opera. And what Elizabeth Pollack did is she spent a year where she did a bunch of surveys and interviews and studies, observations at the beginning of the year and then 1 year later, and wanted to see what the difference was in people's attitudes and behaviors, depending on whether they were listening to health-themed soap operas or reconciliation-themed soap operas. And what she found was at the end of the year, there was no difference in terms of people's actual beliefs about whether they should cooperate with the other group, whether Hutus and Tutsis should actually get along. If they were xenophobic before, they were xenophobic 1 year later. Their beliefs, the content of their beliefs did not shift. However, what did shift, if they were in the reconciliation themed soap opera group, they now believe that other members of their in-group thought reconciliation and cooperation was important. So their beliefs didn't change, but their perception of the social norms changed. Their belief about what they thought other in-group members think changed. And that led to an actual change in behavior, including a 100% increase in cooperative behavior in these various tasks that they had to complete afterwards, intergroup behavior. And that's backed up by a lot of other research showing that you don't need to necessarily change people's beliefs, but change their perception of what they think their in-group thinks. And this is a real world example of where this is currently a problem, is in Pakistan, where you have a lot of problems with blasphemy. And a lot of the majority, I think many people in Pakistan believe blasphemy is probably a sacred value. You should not blaspheme. But where there is division is what you do, what actions you can take if someone does blaspheme. Some minority believe that it's okay to get a vigilante group together and to go lynch mob and go even kill the person or extol punishment on that person themselves. Whereas the majority think, no, you have to leave that up to the state and that's not up to these vigilante groups. But the problem is that the majority of people think that the minority is the majority. They have a misperception of what the actual social norms are. They think the majority think that the vigilante groups are okay. And so now this becomes a challenge of how do you actually shift people's attitude to realize actually the real norms are that we should not be doing this vigilantism. And if the research bears out to be true in this situation, that should actually decrease people's violent behavior in the face of these things. So, but the problem is, how do you do that? A lot of like the community leaders or again, the moderate imams feel uncomfortable coming right out and challenging these norms because they feel like, well, this can turn against me. They could come after me. I know this is one of the questions in the Q&A, which is what do you do with leaders? Sometimes leaders really do have a lot of power and influence and can disseminate messages and people will adhere to them. But sometimes people we perceive to be leaders are more vulnerable than what seems to be the case on the surface. And so that's where things like summary information, where you kind of just release the actual survey poll data, make that ubiquitous, make that everywhere so people actually see what the real research is, that people are not actually supportive of this. But things like edutainment, which is what those soap operas were, which is where you're using art, you're using music and poems and paintings and street art or entertainment, TV shows, movies, all of those things have a big impact on changing perceptions of social norms. That's a big, if you look at attitudes towards homosexuality in the United States, hasn't shifted hugely over the last 20 years. People's personal attitudes about whether gay marriage should be allowed. What has changed again is the perception of social norms. People now think that the norm is that we should be tolerant and accepting of homosexual marriage. And again, media had a big role to play with that. TV shows, movies, reality shows, whatever, popular culture influenced that perceptions of social norms. So those are just some ideas.
Great. Thank you very much for that, Nafis. I think it lays a lot of foundations for some future CV projects there. I'm going to take the first question from the Q&A, one for Moya, but the rest of the panel feel free to jump in if you want to. From your research, is it possible to say that lone wolf attacks in Europe are more likely to come from extreme right-wing individuals, followers of terrorist groups such as Al-Qaeda?
I'm sorry, so you were breaking up a little bit on me, Alistair, so I'm going to say it back to you. So from my research, is it apparent or can it be determined that lone wolf attacks are more likely to come from extreme right actors than individuals associated with violent jihadism?
Yes, that's the question.
So I'm not somebody who has researched lone actor terrorism per se. So my main interest is in the internet and the role of the internet in contemporary violent extremism and terrorism. I guess what I would say is that apparent from both violent jihadi activity online and extreme right-wing activity online is an interest on the part of the producers of content in both ideological realms, if you like, to encourage people to undertake lone actor attacks. A lot of attention has been directed in the last year or more to extreme right online activity and its influence on a number of attackers who've carried out attacks in the US, in New Zealand, in Germany, and elsewhere, the majority of whom had fairly significant online interactions. And so, you know, policymakers, law enforcement, and others, therefore, are now directing a lot more attention to potential extreme right attackers that was previously directed almost exclusively at those associated with violent jihadism, particularly so-called Islamic State.
Thank you very much, Maura. A question for all of you. We've seen the use of propaganda and conspiracy theories used in radicalization and extremism. Does the panel think that cognitive dissonance plays a role in radicalization and extremism to justify violent acts? Do you all hear the question there? Yeah.
I think so. Does cognitive dissonance play a role?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, sure. I mean, cognitive dissonance is one of those things that seems to be just so prevalent everywhere that it probably plays a role in almost every type of social behavior. I can't think of any social behavior where it probably doesn't play a role. But again, yeah, I think it sort of fits in with the same thing with the norm influence, is that if people feel that there is a discrepancy between their actions and the community norms, then that may motivate them to get their behavior in line. And so, yeah, I mean, norm intervention does try to play on cognitive dissonance, whereas direct belief change intervention does not. I mean, it's why public service announcements, for example, where they try to convince people to change their attitudes on something or to change their behavior directly, where they just try to go directly at the person's behaviors or beliefs, show that it actually has very minimal, if no effect, and often sometimes can have negative long-term effects. Like when you look at anti-drug campaigns, for example, part of why people do drugs, teenagers, is actually because it's subversive. And if you're hearing that, you're watching TV and it's, you know, the establishment, whoever they may be, is telling you not to do it, well, it only adds to the subversiveness of it. So it's not going to help. And also people, especially the stronger they hold their beliefs, the more they begin to identify with it. So the more you try to go after someone's beliefs directly, you really are challenging someone's identity. And we have research to show that people become reticent, they become stubborn, they actually can break off social ties. So even encouraging friends or family members to de-radicalize someone can be a very bad strategy, because you're actually not only not changing the person's behavior, but that person may eliminate that social relationship. And so now you have one less social connection, one less tie into influencing that person, one less messenger, a credible messenger in that person's life. Whereas again, if you try to use things like social norms or counter engagement, like what Matt was talking about, where you actually provide people with an alternative pathway for a new community or a new purposeful action that they can get involved with, that may even satisfy some of their material needs as well, you're going to have much more likelihood for success.
Thank you very much, Nafis. Another question for you all. What do you think Western states should do to build resilience against states' misinformation and subversion? A very topical question at the moment. Matt, do you want to? Matt, you're on mute.
Thank you, Alistair. Yeah, I mean, I think this is something we're sort of wrestling with at the moment in Kenya, and the Kenya context is, you know, is different from some of the other contexts we've sort of talked about so far. I think what I emphasize and bring back to is this idea of building the strength of the media. I think their role in creating norms and including people, it has significance. And I don't think in many ways the media has been seen wholly as the problem, as purveyors and transmitters of ideology and providing that oxygen of publicity that gets talked about so much when it comes to terrorism. But when you distinguish talking about acts of terrorism and terrorism organizations from the causes of terrorism, and you can easily go outside the language of violence extremism, talk about family life and completely depoliticize the subject, you realize these are subjects that the media have a crucial role to play in. And that educative element can help deal with the misinformation and some of the propaganda we've been talking about.
Right. Remember in your presentation, you were talking about some of the work you were doing about conflict sensitive reporting and the importance of that. What do you want to say a few more words about that? Because it's often something which is, I think, very important, but not talked about that much.
Yeah. I mean, in fact, RUSI held a very interesting event a couple of weeks ago talking about the role of the media in reporting on terrorism. And it does go back to this subject about the dilemma is often posed in terms of breaking news and news bulletins, in terms of the imagery and the harm that sort of the oxygen that is produced in the wake of an attack. And what we try to do with conflict sensitive journalism is in that period of calm that does eventually happen after attacks, is how can we talk about conflicts, levels of conflict in families, about ideology, about resources, some age old, some are very much cultural and clash of cultures. But how can we talk about those ideas of conflict in a much broader way, and then link them to what's going on in the country in terms of violent action? And the other thing I would say is, we have to also, in many ways, go into these contexts with a very different mindset. This is some ways the problem with countering violent extremism as a sort of umbrella term, is that it globalizes what is inherently, and what all the research says is hyperlocal. And actually, when you think about the position of those groups and those individuals who are at risk of joining, you see from their point of view, they've got a whole set of different priorities from the nation state, or from governments, or from donors, or indeed from local leaders and civil society organizations. And they're concerned with all sorts of different forms of violence, be it vigilante violence, criminal gang violence, state violence, and sexual and gender-based violence, as well as terrorist violence. So I think an alteration in perspective is often quite useful when we think about this sort of question. And that's what kind of conflict-sensitive journalism can do. It can broaden that mindset and bring in other ideas, and think about resolving conflict rather than simply countering messages.
Great. Thank you very much, Matt. Okay, I have another question for Moira. How do you think the government regulations that prohibit hate speech and extremism, especially in Europe, where it's more to take down content than the US, for instance, will have an impact on right-wing extremism online? So essentially, how do we think government regulations on prohibiting hate speech will have an impact on right-wing extremism online?
Yeah, so I think this is a very important, even a foundational issue that doesn't get enough attention, which is to say the really distinctly different attitudes that are observable amongst Western liberal democracies on this issue, and so that's even quite beside a whole host of other countries who also have views. But if we look at Western liberal democracies, there is the US and there is the rest. Basically, like I said, the US First Amendment and all the attendant jurisprudence and whatnot it really gives an enormous amount of leeway with regard to speech, including hate speech or hateful speech, if you like, and around extremism and terrorism and what have you on the one hand. And then there is what you might term as sort of a broadly European approach, but actually it's shared by countries much wider than in the European setting, and they have a much less permissive approach. So these are countries that have quite a lot of legislation already in place, even pre-internet days, around hate and extremism and terrorism and what was permissible to say in the real world, in inverted commas. And so there was already a lot of regulation out there of, for example, traditional mass media and basically all European countries, for example, and that was also responsive to past campaigns of extremism and terrorism, such as in, for example, the UK and Ireland, but also obviously Germany, stretching back even further and what have you. And so the attitude of the EU and EU member states is this is an area that needs to be regulated, that online is not an exception to those regulations. And what they've said for a long time is that what's illegal offline in EU countries is also illegal online. And in the last number of years, they have begun to take further steps in that regard. And so what you see is things like the code of conduct around hate speech, for example, a number of years ago. And now, of course, there is the terrorism content directive, for example. And we also see legislation that's been introduced in Germany, like the NetzDG, recently in France. And there is other legislation that looks to be on the cards in Australia, New Zealand, and elsewhere. Let me say that, you know, I am somebody who favors a regulation in this area, just because all media to date has been regulated, and that is a sensible thing to do. I think that ultimately the decisions have to be taken by government, because that is the job of government in democratic societies. I have the feeling that we're in quite an early stage of this whole process, and so some of the legislation that is being developed hasn't been as well thought through as I think it might be. So I am not uncritical of any of this legislation, but if what we're talking about is a sort of a free-for-all online versus regulations being put in place, and essentially so via legislation in democratic countries, well then certainly that would be my preference.
Thank you very much, Maura. We're moving into the last sort of 6 or 7 minutes, so I think I'll take a couple of questions quickly. One rather direct question to you, Nafis. Are advertisers and propagandists wasting their time and money? I think this is in reference to your argument about mass persuasion not being as successful as what we think. You're still on mute.
Yeah, they're probably not using it in the most effective way possible. So, I mean, where the data shows advertising does work is when people have no experience with the product, then advertising will encourage people to go try something new that they hadn't tried before. But ultimately, they make a decision about whether they like it or not, and then more advertising doesn't necessarily make them want to go back to it. So there it can have an effect. Also, it can have an effect when people are trying to make a rational decision. If they know they're on the market for, I don't know, a Mercedes-Benz, then seeing an advertisement that there's a new discount on Mercedes-Benz at the local car dealership, then that can actually have an impact on them as well. Like I said, when the celebrity or whoever is an actual expert in the field, who they imbue with some degree of trustworthiness and authoritativeness, it can then help there as well. But when it comes to more of like the political domain, where I would say advertising can have an effect, again, norm interventions won't change people's beliefs, but they can change people's motivation to go to the polls or to not go to the polls. So as a result, it can actually swing votes sometimes. And it can take people who already hold ideas that are in the general direction of the communication and amplify it and make it stronger, so they can increase the strength of people's attitudes, but it rarely changes the valence of people's attitudes, the actual binary. If they disagree with something, they're not going to start agreeing with it all of a sudden because of disembodied messages. But also, I would say that messaging in combination with an on-the-ground effort, or even a social media effort where it's using people who are already in the network of the person, can be more effective.
Thank you very much, Nafis. Final question for all of the panel. Do you think that far-right extremism, particularly on social media, has become integrated into the more mainstream debate, and what risk does this pose? Does it increase its legitimacy amongst supporters, or the opposite? I think this builds on something you were saying earlier, Moira, and certainly I think a lot of us worked in this field before that. When we've been dealing with Islamic State, in some ways, we're lucky with Islamic State that everyone recognized it was a bad thing. Whereas when you move to other groups, it's the debate is often more fractured.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, agreed, Alistair. So yes, I don't think there is any doubt, like I alluded to earlier, that what's often termed the Overton window. So like I said, what it is allowable to say in a public setting. So what's allowable in the public discourse. And that has shifted really quite far rightward in a relatively short space of time. So basically all I'm referring to here is that people feel free to say things now, either in real world settings or in online settings, that they would never have thought to say in either of those settings, say 3 to 5 years ago, because those would have been viewed, some of what they're saying now would have been viewed as very extremist in its orientation, whereas now some of those views have been normalized. And so that is, I think, quite problematic. And it goes, like I already mentioned, I think, to something that Nafis was saying about the social ecology, so about the social context in which we all find ourselves. And if it is going distinctly rightward, that is potentially a problem, I think, for all of us.
Thank you very much, Maura. Matt and Nafis, do you have anything you'd like to add to that? Yep.
I actually have a question. Can I ask Moira a question? I mean, one thing that I've been thinking about when it comes to, I've been looking at conspiracy theories online, and I mean, I think even the Wall Street Journal article that you had mentioned in the test about how sometimes Facebook's regulation policies might target people on the right wing more. Maybe there's more conspiracy theories on the right wing. I wonder if part of the reason why is because there's a general left-leaning element in the media, and that has caused more sort of alternative right-wing media to propagate, where the journalistic standards are very different, where you can't really tell the difference between someone who has a YouTube channel and is doing really deep investigative work versus someone who's just making things up. And so it causes people to go into this sphere of alt-right media or whatever kind of alternative media, not necessarily even alt-right. And in that alternative sphere, you have maybe some really good citizen journalism, but also some total, fake news, misinformation, all that stuff mixed in it as well. And so maybe it's not something particularly wrong with the right wing necessarily itself, but maybe the general left bias has created this alternative ecology that then people have found themselves in. And then maybe there is something that left-leaning media, mainstream media could do to sort of increase their credibility with that part of the audience to bring some of those people back.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting, that's an interesting idea. I guess I'd have to reflect on it, to be honest with you, a little bit more. Yeah, but I see where you're, I guess I see where you're going with that point. Come back to me is, I guess, all I could say. I really have to think on it.
Really?
Sure, no, I just had the idea this morning, so yeah, no worries.
Okay, watch this space. Matt, you're mute.
Yeah, this role of media in forming norms is, I mean, I think it is is very useful, and to think about the problems that exist in any given sort of media ecology, and where if information flows from and to, and who's involved in forming those norms. And it does strike me that in Kenya, but also in plenty of other contexts, and you can point to countries in Europe, there are distinct parts of the country that feel alienated from setting a lot of those norms. And we can have you can have a debate about messages and the effectiveness of how you spread messages, but it's that participation and that role in forming those norms, which addresses their lives and their issues, that can have a real effect.
And I guess what I would say about that is that also I think that maybe there is too much of a focus at the present time also in terms of a lot of these discussions about social media in particular, rather than the broader online ecology, in which there's a whole bunch of other types of online spaces that are important. But also going back to Nafis's original question to me, the sort of dialectical relationship, if you like, between the online and the offline, if that's even any more, a distinguishing factor, if you want, but between, let's say, the dialectical relationship between traditional media and online media, and so that whole even vastly wider ecology. Again, I think that those are definitely important aspects that need more attention.
Great, thank you very much. It's been a fascinating conversation, but unfortunately we've reached the end of our hour. So I'd just like to thank RUSI for hosting this webinar, and thank everyone who's tuned in to listen to us and to watch us and ask us questions. Thank you very much. And also just a reminder that the special issue is open access until the end of June. So please take time to check it out and have a look at some of the articles. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.